19. The need to avoid contempt and hatred. Now, having talked about the most important of the qualities enumerated above, I want to discuss the others briefly under this generalization, that the prince should, as I have already suggested, determine to avoid anything which will make him hated and despised. So long as he does so, he will have done what he should, and he will run no risk whatsoever if he is reproached for the other vices I mentioned. He will be hated above all if, as I said, he is rapacious and aggressive with regard to the property and the women of his subjects. He must refrain from these, as long as he does not rob the great majority of their property or their honor. They remain content. He then has to contend only with the ambition of a few, and that can be dealt with easily and in a variety of ways. He will be despised if he has a reputation for being fickle, frivolous, effeminate, cowardly, irresolute. A prince should avoid this like the plague, and strive to demonstrate his actions, grandeur, courage, sobriety, and strength. When settling disputes between his subjects, he should ensure that his judgment is irrevocable, and he should be so regarded that no one ever dreams of trying to deceive or trick him. The prince who succeeds in having himself thus regarded is highly esteemed, and against a man who is highly esteemed, conspiracy is difficult, and open attack is difficult, provided he is recognized as a great man who is respected by his subjects. There are two things a prince must fear: internal subversion from his subjects, and external aggression by foreign powers. Against the latter, his defense lies in being well armed and having good allies. And if he is well armed, he will always have good allies. In addition, domestic affairs will always remain under control, provided that relations with external powers are under control, and if indeed they were not disturbed by a conspiracy. Even if there is disturbance abroad, if the prince has ordered his government and lived as I said, and if he does not capitulate, he will always repulse every onslaught, just as I said Nabis the Spartan did. Now, as far as his subjects are concerned, when there is no disturbance abroad, the prince's chief fear must be a secret conspiracy. He can adequately guard against this if he avoids being hated or scorned, and keeps the people satisfied. This, as I have said above at length, is crucial. One of the most important safeguards a prince can have against conspiracies is to avoid being hated by the populace. This is because the conspirator always thinks that by killing the prince, he will satisfy the people. But if he thinks that he will outrage the people, he will never have the courage to go ahead with his enterprise, because there are countless obstacles in the path of a conspirator. As experience shows, there have been many conspiracies, but few of them have achieved their end. This is because the conspirator needs others to help him, and those have to be men who, he believes, are disgruntled. But as soon as he reveals his mind to a man who is dissatisfied, he gives him the means to get satisfaction, because by telling all he knows, the latter can hope to obtain all he wants. Seeing the sure profit to be won by informing, and the highly dangerous and doubtful alternative, a man must be either a rare friend indeed, or else an utterly relentless enemy of the prince, to keep faith with you. To put it briefly, I say that on the side of the conspirator, there is nothing except fear, envy, and the terrifying prospect of punishment. On the side of the prince, there is the majesty of government. There are laws, the resources of his friends, and of the state to protect him. Add to all these the goodwill of the people, and it is unthinkable that anyone should be so rash as to conspire. For whereas in the normal course of events a conspirator has cause for fear before he acts, in this case he has cause for fear afterwards as well, seeing that the people are hostile to him. He will have accomplished his crime, and, because the people are against him, he will have no place of refuge. I could give countless illustrations of this, but I will content myself with just one, which happened in the time of our fathers. The Cannesci conspired against and killed Messer Annibale Bentivoglio, grandfather of the present Annibale and Prince of Bologna. There remained as his heir only Messer Giovanni, who was still in swaddling clothes. Immediately this murder was perpetrated, the people rose up and killed all the Cannesci. They were inspired by the goodwill that existed for the house of Bentivoglio at that period. It was so great that although there was no member of the family left in Bologna to take over the government on the death of Annibale, the citizens of Bologna, hearing that there was someone in Florence who was of the Bentivoglio family, but had until then been thought to be the son of a smith, went there to find him. They entrusted him with the government of the city, and he ruled until Giovanni was old enough to assume the government himself. I conclude, therefore, that when a prince has the goodwill of the people, he must not worry about conspiracies, but when the people are hostile and regard him with hatred, he must go in fear of everything and everyone. Well-organized states and wise princes have always taken great pains not to make the nobles despair, and to satisfy the people and keep them content. This is one of the most important tasks a prince must undertake. Among kingdoms which are well organized and governed in our own time is that of France. It possesses countless valuable institutions on which the king's freedom of action and security depend. The first of these is the Parliament and its authority. For the lawgiver of the French kingdom, knowing the ambition and insolence of the powerful, judged it necessary that they should be restrained by having a bit in their mouths. On the other hand, he wanted to protect the masses, knowing how they feared and therefore hated the nobles. He did not want this to be the particular responsibility of the king, because he wished to save him from being reproached by the nobles for favoring the people, and by the people for favoring the nobles. So he instituted an independent arbiter to crush the nobles and favor the weak, without bringing reproach on the king. There could be no better or more sensible institution, nor one more effective in ensuring the security of the king and the kingdom. From this can be drawn another noteworthy consideration, that princes should delegate to others the enactment of unpopular measures, and keep in their own hands the means of winning favors. Again, I conclude that a prince should value the nobles, but not make himself hated by the people. Many who have studied the lives and deaths of certain Roman emperors may perhaps believe that they provide examples contradicting my opinion. Some emperors who led consistently worthy lives and showed strength of character nonetheless fell from power, or were even done to death by their own men who conspired against them. As I wish to answer these objections, I shall discuss the characters of some of the emperors, showing that the reasons for their downfall are not different from those I have adduced. I shall submit for consideration examples which are well known to the students of the period. I shall also restrict myself to all those emperors who came to power from Marcus the philosopher to Maximinus. These were Marcus Aurelius, Commodius his son, Pertinax, Julian, Severus, Caracalla his son, Marcrinus, Heliogabalus, Alexander, and Maximinus. First, it is to be noted that whereas other princes have to contend only with the ambition of the nobles and the insolence of the people, the Roman emperors encountered a third difficulty. They had to contend with the cruelty and avarice of the soldiers. This was a hard task, and it was responsible for the downfall of many, since it was difficult to satisfy both the soldiers and the populace. The latter, being peace-loving, liked unadventurous emperors, while the soldiers loved a warlike ruler, and one who was arrogant, cruel, and rapacious. They wanted him to treat the people accordingly, so that they could be paid more and give vent to their own avarice and cruelty. As a result, those emperors who did not have the natural authority or the standing to hold both the soldiers and the populace in check always came to grief. Most of them, especially those who were new to government, when they recognized the difficulty of satisfying these two diverse elements, appeased the soldiers and did not worry about injuring the populace. This policy was necessary. Princes cannot help arousing hatred in some quarters, so they first must strive not to be hated by all and every class of subject. And when this proves impossible, they should strive more assiduously to escape the hatred of the most powerful classes. Therefore, those emperors who, because they were new men, needed out of the ordinary support, were more ready to throw in their lot with the soldiers than with the people. Nonetheless, this proved to be advantageous or not, depending on whether the ruler knew how to maintain his standing with the troops. Now, for the reasons given above, it came about that Marcus Aurelius, Pertinax, and Alexander, who all lived unadventurously, who loved justice, hated cruelty, were kind and courteous, all, Marcus apart, had an unhappy end. Marcus alone was held during his life and after in high esteem, because he succeeded to the empire by hereditary right, and did not have to thank either the soldiers or the populace for it. Then, as he possessed many qualities which earned him great respect, all his life he succeeded in holding both of these in check, and he was never hated or scorned. But Pertinax came to grief in the early stages of his administration. He was created emperor against the will of the soldiers, who had been used to living licentiously under Commodus, and so could not tolerate the decency which Pertinax wished to impose on them. So the emperor made himself hated, and also, since he was an old man, scorned. And here it should be noted that one can be hated just as much for good deeds as for evil ones. Therefore, as I said above, a prince who wants to maintain his rule is often forced not to be good, because whenever that class of men on which you believe your continued rule depends is corrupt, whether it be the populace or soldiers or nobles, you have to satisfy it by adopting the same disposition. And then good deeds are your enemies. But let us come to Alexander. He was a man of such goodness that, among the other things for which he is given credit, it is said that during the 14 years he reigned, he never put anyone to death without trial. Nonetheless, as he was thought effeminate, and a man who let himself be ruled by his mother, he came to be scorned, and the army conspired against him and killed him. Discussing in contrast the characters of Commodus, Severus, Antonius Caracalla, and Maximinus, you will find them to have been extremely cruel and rapacious. To satisfy the soldiers, there was no kind of injury they did not inflict on the people, and all of them except Severus came to an unhappy end. Severus was a man of such prowess that, keeping the soldiers friendly, even though the people were oppressed by him, he reigned successfully to the end. This was because his prowess so impressed the soldiers and the people that the latter were in a certain manner left astonished and stupefied, and the former stayed respectful and content. Because what Severus did was remarkable and outstanding for a new prince, I want to show briefly how well he knew how to act the part of both a fox and a lion, whose natures, as I say above, must be imitated by a new prince. Knowing the indolence of the Emperor Julian, Severus persuaded the troops he commanded in Slavonia to march on Rome to avenge the death of Pertinax, who had been put to death by the Praetorian guards. Under this pretext, without any indication that he aspired to the empire, he moved the army against Rome, and he arrived in Italy before it was known that he had set out. When he came, the Senate, out of fear, elected him emperor and put Julian to death. After this start, there remained two obstacles in the way of his becoming master of all the state. One was in Asia, where Persenius Niger, commander of the Asiatic army, had himself proclaimed emperor. The other was in the west, where Albinus also aspired to the empire. Judging it was dangerous to show himself hostile to both of them, Severus decided to attack Niger and to trick Albinus. He wrote to the latter saying that, having been elected emperor by the Senate, he wished to share the high rank with him. He sent him the title of Caesar, and, through a resolution in the Senate, he made him co-emperor. Albinus took all these things at their face value, but once Severus had defeated Niger and put him to death, and had pacified the East, he returned to Rome and complained in the Senate that Albinus, not recognizing the favors he had received from him, had treacherously sought to kill him. Because of this, Severus added, it was necessary for him to go and punish such ingratitude. He then marched against him in France, and took from him his state and his life. So whoever carefully studies what this man did will find that he had the qualities of a ferocious lion and a very cunning fox, and that he was feared and respected by everyone, yet not hated by the troops. And it will not be thought anything to marvel at if Severus, an upstart, proved himself able to maintain such great power, because his tremendous prestige always protected him from the hatred which his plundering had inspired in the people. Now, Antoninus Caracalla, his son, was also a man of splendid qualities which astonished the people and endeared him to the soldiers. He was a military man, capable of any exertion, and he scorned softness of any kind, at the table or elsewhere. This won him the devotion of the troops. None the less, his ferocity and cruelty were so great and unparalleled. After countless individual murders, he put to death great numbers of Romans and all the citizens of Alexandria, that he became universally hated. Even those closest to him started to fear him, and as a result he was killed by a centurion when he was surrounded by his troops. Here it should be noted that princes cannot escape death if the attempt is made by a fanatic, because anyone who has no fear of death himself can succeed in inflicting it. On the other hand, there is less need for a prince to be afraid, since such assassinations are very rare. However, the prince should restrain himself from inflicting grave injury on anyone in his service, whom he has close to him in his affairs of state. That was how Antoninus erred. He put to death, with disgrace, a brother of that centurion, whom in turn he threatened every day, even though still retaining him in his bodyguard. This rash behavior was calculated to bring him grief, as in the end it did. But let us come to Commodus, for whom ruling the empire was an easy task, since being the son of Marcus Aurelius, he held it by hereditary right. He had only to follow in the footsteps of his father, and then he would have satisfied the soldiers and the people. But as he was of a cruel, bestial disposition, he endeavored to indulge the soldiers and make them dissolute, in order to exercise his rapacity on the people. On the other hand, he forgot his dignity, often descended into the amphitheaters to fight with the gladiators, and did other ignoble things, hardly worthy of the imperial majesty. As a result, the soldiers came to despise him. So being hated on the one side and scorned on the other, he fell victim to a conspiracy which ended in his death. It now remains for us to describe the character of Maximinus. He was a very warlike man, and the troops, being sick of the effeminacies of Alexander, whom I discussed above, elected him emperor after Alexander's death. He did not hold the empire for long, because two things made him hated and despised. First, he was of the lowest origins, having once been a shepherd in Thrace. This was well known to everybody, and lowered him in everyone's eyes. Second, at his accession, he put off going to Rome to be formally hailed as emperor, and he impressed people as being extremely savage, because he inflicted many cruelties through his prefects in Rome and in other parts of the empire. As a result, there was a universal upsurge of indignation against him because of his mean birth, and an upsurge of hatred caused by fear of his ferocity. First Africa rebelled, and then the Senate, with the support of all the people of Rome. All Italy conspired against him. The conspiracy was joined by his own troops, who, when they were besieging Aquileia and finding difficulties in taking the town, sickened of his cruelty. Seeing how many enemies he had, they feared him less, and they killed him. I do not want to discuss Heliogabalus, or Macrinus, or Julian, who were thoroughly despised and therefore did not last long. Instead, I shall conclude by saying that contemporary princes are less troubled by this problem of having to take extraordinary measures to satisfy the soldiers. They do have to give them some consideration, but notwithstanding this, the problem is soon settled, because princes today do not possess standing armies which, like the armies of the Roman Empire, have become firmly established in the government and administration of conquered territories. So, if in Roman times it was necessary to satisfy the demands of the soldiers rather than those of the people, this was because the soldiers had more power than the people. In our own times, it is necessary for all rulers, except the Turk and the Sultan, to conciliate the people rather than the soldiers, because the people are the more powerful. I make an exception of the Turk because that ruler maintains a standing army of 12,000 infantry and 15,000 cavalry, essential to the security and strength of his kingdom, and so he must subordinate every other consideration to that of retaining their loyalty. Similarly, the Sultan's dominion is completely in the hands of his soldiers, and he also, without regard for the people, must make sure of their allegiance to him. You should note that the Sultan's state differs from all the other principalities, being similar to the papacy, which cannot be called either a hereditary or a new principality. It is not the sons of the former ruler who inherit and become rulers, but the one elected by those with the authority to do so. As this system is an ancient one, it cannot be classified among the new principalities. There are none of the difficulties encountered in a new principality, although the prince is new. The institutions of the state are old, and they are devised to accommodate him as if he were the hereditary ruler. But let us go back to the subject. I say that whoever follows my argument will realize that the downfall of the emperors I mentioned was caused by either hatred or scorn. He will also recognize why it happened that, some of them behaving one way and some of them another, in both cases one ended happily, and the rest came to grief. As they were new princes, it was useless and disastrous for Pertinax and Alexander to want to imitate Marcus Aurelius, who succeeded by hereditary right. Similarly, it was fatal for Caracalla, Commodus, and Maximinus to imitate Severus, since they lacked the prowess to follow in his footsteps. Therefore, a new prince in a new principality cannot imitate the actions of Marcus Aurelius, nor is he bound to follow those of Severus. Rather, he should select from Severus the qualities necessary to establish his state, and from Marcus Aurelius those which are conducive to its maintenance and glory after it has been stabilized and made secure.